The first time I saw the ghost truck, I thought I was hallucinating from too many hours on the road. By the third time, I knew something wasn't right. But it wasn't until that final night, when it tried to run me off the road, that I truly understood the danger I was in. My name's Jack, and I've been hauling freight across the country for over 2 decades now. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on the lonely highways. Sleep deprivation and isolation can play tricks on your mind, but nothing could have prepared me for what started happening last month on my regular Dallas to Phoenix route. It was a crisp autumn night just past 2 a.m. I was about 4 hours into my drive, cruising down I-20 somewhere in West Texas. The road stretched out endlessly before me, empty save for the occasional passenger car. The radio was turned down low, just loud enough to keep me company without being distracting. I glanced in my side mirror, a habit ingrained after years behind the wheel. That's when I saw it for the first time. A set of headlights, way back in the distance. Nothing unusual there. But as I watched, the lights seemed to flicker and waver like heat shimmer on asphalt. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. When I looked again, the truck behind me had gotten closer. Much closer. Impossibly closer. It was a big rig, an old Peterbilt model that looked like it had rolled straight out of the 1970s. Its chrome finish gleamed unnaturally bright in the moonlight. My heart rate picked up. There was no way that truck could have closed the distance so quickly. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. After a few deep breaths, I chanced another look in the mirror. The old Peterbilt was gone. The highway behind me was completely empty. I let out a shaky laugh, chalking it up to road fatigue. Maybe it was time for another cup of coffee at the next truck stop. I cranked up the radio, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The rest of that night's drive was uneventful. By the time I pulled into Phoenix the next afternoon, the incident was all but forgotten. Just another strange mirage from the nighttime roads. It was a week later when I saw it again. Different stretch of highway this time, about halfway between Albuquerque and Flagstaff. The moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, leaving the interstate cloaked in darkness, broken only by my headlights. I was idly scanning my mirrors when a flash of movement caught my eye. Seemingly out of nowhere, there it was again, that ghostly Peterbilt, chrome glinting despite the lack of moonlight. A chill ran down my spine as I watched it quickly gain on me in the mirror. This time I was determined to get a better look. I slowed down slightly, allowing the truck to pull up alongside me, but when I turned my head to look out the passenger window, there was nothing there. The right lane was empty. My blood ran cold as I snapped my gaze back to the mirror. The Peterbilt was still there, pacing me perfectly. I could make out more details now, the way the paint was peeling slightly around the fenders, the old-fashioned CB antenna swaying slightly. It looked solid and real, but it couldn't be, not if it didn't show up outside my mirror. I blinked rapidly, willing the apparition to disappear. When I looked again, the highway behind me was dark and empty once more. My hands were shaking as I pulled into the next rest stop. I splashed cold water on my face in the grimy bathroom, staring at my haggard reflection. What the hell was happening to me? Was I cracking up after all these years on the road? I called my wife from the payphone, needing to hear a familiar voice. We chatted about nothing important. The kids' school activities, some repairs needed around the house. I didn't mention what I'd seen. How could I, without sounding like I'd lost my mind? As the weeks went by, I found myself growing more and more anxious every time I had to drive that route. I started seeing the ghost truck more frequently, always in my mirrors, always vanishing when I tried to get a direct look at it. Sometimes it would appear for just a split second before fading away. Other times it would pace me for miles, always maintaining the same distance no matter how I varied my speed. I stopped driving at night whenever I could avoid it. I cut back on my caffeine intake, wondering if too many energy drinks were messing with my head. I even went to see an eye doctor, but he said my vision was perfectly fine. None of it helped. The ghostly Peterbilt kept appearing with increasing frequency. And worse, it was starting to feel malevolent. Where before it had simply paced me, now it would edge closer and closer in the mirror. Sometimes I swore I could make out a shadowy figure behind the wheel, staring directly at me. I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep, jumping at every sound and shadow. My work started to suffer. I was making stupid mistakes, missing deadlines. My dispatcher pulled me aside one day, asking if everything was all right. I mumbled some excuse about family stress. How could I tell anyone the truth? That I was being haunted by some kind of phantom semi that only existed in my rearview mirrors. They'd pull me off the road so fast it would make my head spin. And despite everything, I couldn't bear the thought of giving up driving. It was all I'd known for most of my adult life. It all came to a head about a month ago. I was on the last leg of a long haul, less than 100 miles out from the Dallas depot. It was well past midnight, a new moon leaving the world pitch black beyond my headlights. I was exhausted, struggling to keep my eyes open. But I was nearly home. I just had to make it a little farther. I saw the flash of chrome in my mirror and my heart sank. Not now. Not when I was so close. The Peterbilt materialized out of the darkness, closer than it had ever been before. I could see every detail with terrifying clarity. The bugs splattered on its grille, the mud caked on its wheels. It was more solid, more real than ever before. I pressed down on the accelerator, trying to put some distance between us. The ghost truck matched my speed effortlessly. I pushed my rig faster, taking curves too quickly, passing cars with reckless abandon. None of it mattered. The Peterbilt stayed right on my tail, so close I could no longer see its headlights in the mirror. Panic clawed at my throat. This was no hallucination, no trick of an exhausted mind. This thing, whatever it was, meant to harm me. I had to get away. I saw my chance coming up, a long, gentle curve followed by a straightaway. If I could just get enough speed on the turn, maybe I could gain some ground on the stretch. I took the curve as fast as I dared, feeling my truck list dangerously. Ahead, the straight section of road beckoned. I mashed the accelerator to the floor as I came out of the turn. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought I'd made it. The mirror showed empty road behind me. Then the Peterbilt was there, surging forward with impossible speed. I felt the impact as it slammed into my trailer. My truck fishtailed wildly as I fought for control. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the guardrail approaching in horrible slow motion. I wrenched the wheel, brakes screeching in protest. There was a moment of weightlessness as my trailer jackknifed. I remember a cacophony of screaming metal and shattering glass, then darkness. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. They told me I was lucky to be alive, that a passing motorist had seen my wreck and called for help, that I must have fallen asleep at the wheel. I didn't bother trying to tell them the truth. When I was finally released, I went to see what was left of my truck. The damage was catastrophic. It would never drive again. As I ran my hand along the crumpled driver's side, something caught my eye. There, in the mangled remains of my side mirror, I saw a reflection. For a split second, an old Peterbilt gleamed in the Texas sun. Then it was gone. I quit driving the next day. My wife was relieved. She'd been trying to get me to find a safer line of work for years. We decided to move, to make a fresh start somewhere new, somewhere far from long, dark highways. But some nights I still dream of endless roads, of chrome flashing in my mirrors, of a ghostly truck that gets closer and closer, no matter how fast I run. And I wonder, are my nights of terror truly over? Or is that phantom Peterbilt still out there somewhere, waiting for me to get back behind the wheel? The music always starts at mile marker 237. No matter how many times I drive this stretch of highway, no matter what time of day or night, it's always the same. The haunting melody that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I've tried to ignore it, to drown it out, but nothing works. And the worst part? I'm the only one who can hear it. My name's Sarah, and I've been a long-haul trucker for the better part of a decade. I love the open road, the sense of freedom that comes with pointing your rig towards the horizon and just going. But lately that freedom has started to feel more like a cage, all because of that damn music. It started about 6 months ago. I was on my usual route, a straight shot down I-40 from Knoxville to Little Rock. It was a quiet night, just past 2 a.m., the kind of night where it feels like you're the only person left in the world. I remember glancing at my odometer as I passed mile marker 236, idly calculating how much further I had to go. That's when I first heard it. A soft, lilting melody that seemed to drift in through my closed windows. At first, I thought it was just the radio acting up. But when I reached to turn it off, I realized it wasn't on. The music grew louder as I continued down the highway. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A strange mix of piano and what sounded like glass chimes, with an underlying rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my heart. It was beautiful, in a haunting sort of way, but it was also deeply unsettling. I pulled over at the next rest stop, hands shaking as I cut the engine. The moment I crossed mile marker 238, the music faded away like it had never existed. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, I chalked it up to road fatigue and too much caffeine. I continued on my way, shaken but determined to forget about the whole thing. But it happened again on my next run, and the next, always starting at mile marker 237, always ending at 238. Always the same hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to bypass my ears and play directly in my mind. I started dreading that stretch of highway. I'd tense up as I approached mile marker 236, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. But no matter how prepared I thought I was, the music always caught me off guard. It wormed its way into my brain, making it hard to focus on the road. I tried everything I could think of to block it out. I cranked up my radio, wore noise-canceling headphones, even tried stuffing my ears with cotton. Nothing worked. The music cut through it all, clear as a bell. About a month in, I finally worked up the courage to mention it to another driver at a truck stop. "Hey, Mike," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "You ever notice anything weird around mile marker 237 on I-40? Like, I don't know, music or something?" Mike looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Music? On the highway? Nah, can't say I have. You feeling okay, Sarah?" I forced a laugh, playing it off as a joke, but inside my stomach was churning. If Mike couldn't hear it, did that mean I was going crazy? As the weeks went by, the music started to affect me more and more. I found myself humming the melody under my breath even when I was nowhere near that stretch of highway. It haunted my dreams, turning them into surreal landscapes where I was endlessly driving down a road that never ended, the music growing louder and louder until I woke up in a cold sweat. I started taking longer routes, adding hours to my drive just to avoid that particular stretch of I-40. My dispatcher noticed, asking why my fuel consumption had suddenly spiked. I made up excuses about construction and traffic, anything to avoid telling the truth, but I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, a tight deadline forced me back onto that dreaded highway. As I approached mile marker 236, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the rumble of my engine. The music started right on cue. But this time it was different, louder, more insistent. The melody had changed too, becoming more complex, almost frantic. It filled the cab of my truck, drowning out everything else. I could barely see the road through the haze of sound. That's when I saw her. A figure standing on the side of the road, right at mile marker 237. A woman in a white dress, her long hair blowing in a wind I couldn't feel. As I watched, horrified, she stepped out into the road directly in front of my truck. I swerved hard, my trailer fishtailing dangerously. I fought for control, the music reaching a deafening crescendo in my ears. Through some miracle, I managed to straighten out without jackknifing. When I looked back, the woman was gone. I was shaking so bad I could barely steer, but I managed to pull over onto the shoulder. The moment I passed mile marker 238, the music cut out abruptly, leaving me in a silence so profound it was almost painful. I sat there for a long time, my face in my hands, trying to slow my racing heart. What the hell was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? When I finally felt steady enough to drive again, I headed straight for the nearest truck stop. I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers. I spent the next few days scouring the internet for any information I could find. I searched for reports of strange music on I-40, for accidents near mile marker 237, for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. Most of what I found was useless, ghost stories and urban legends that didn't match what I was going through. But then I stumbled across an old news article that made my blood run cold. It was from about 30 years ago. A horrible pileup on I-40 right around mile marker 237. The article mentioned that one of the victims was a young woman who had been on her way to Nashville to audition for a record deal. She died at the scene. The woman's name was Melody. I must have read that article 100 times, my mind racing. Could it be possible? Was I somehow hearing the music that Melody never got to share with the world? The next time I had to drive that route, I was terrified. But I was also filled with a strange sense of purpose. As I approached mile marker 236, I took a deep breath and spoke aloud to my empty cab. Melody, if you're there, I hear you. Your music is beautiful. The melody started as it always did, but this time it felt different. Softer, almost grateful. I found myself relaxing into it, letting it wash over me. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid. As I passed mile marker 238, the music faded away gently like a lullaby ending, but I swear, just before it disappeared completely, I heard a woman's voice whisper, "Thank you." From that day on, things changed. The music still plays every time I drive that stretch of highway, but now, instead of filling me with dread, it feels like greeting an old friend. I've even started to look forward to it, those few minutes of otherworldly beauty in the middle of my long, lonely drives. I've never told anyone else about Melody or her music. Who would believe me? But sometimes, on quiet nights when the stars are bright and the road stretches endlessly before me, I think about her. About the dreams she never got to fulfill, the music she never got to share with the world. And I feel honored that in some small way I get to help keep her memory alive, 1 mile at a time, one haunting melody at a time. So if you're ever driving down I-40 late at night and you pass mile marker 237, roll down your windows. Listen closely. You might not hear anything but the wind and the rumble of your engine. Or you might just catch the faintest whisper of a song, a melody that was never sung, played by a musician who never was, echoing down the endless highway. I've been driving trucks for 25 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing could have prepared me for that night on Route 66 when I met the mechanic who saved my life and then vanished into thin air. It's a story I've never told anyone, partly because I'm not sure they'd believe me, and partly because I'm still not entirely sure I believe it myself. It was a crisp October night, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs and the stars seem to burn a little brighter. I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to LA, running behind schedule thanks to some nasty weather back in Illinois. The dispatcher was breathing down my neck, so I decided to push through the night instead of stopping at my usual motel in Amarillo. Big mistake. I was about 50 miles west of Tucumcari, New Mexico when it happened. The cab of my Peterbilt was quiet except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. I was sipping my third cup of coffee, trying to ignore the burning in my eyes from too many hours on the road. That's when I heard it. A loud bang from somewhere under the hood, followed by an ominous rattling sound. My heart sank as I felt the truck start to lose power. I managed to guide it onto the shoulder just as the engine gave out completely. "Damn it," I muttered, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. I was in the middle of nowhere, at least 20 miles from the nearest town, and to make matters worse, my cell phone was showing no signal. I popped the hood and climbed out of the cab, flashlight in hand. Now I know my way around an engine, but what I saw when I shone that light under the hood, it didn't make any sense. Parts were twisted in ways they shouldn't be, and there was a smell like burnt rubber and ozone. It was like looking at a mechanical crime scene. I was standing there trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do when I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Relief flooded through me as I saw headlights coming around the bend. It was an old tow truck, the kind you don't see much anymore, all rounded edges and faded paint. The truck pulled up behind me and a man got out. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to glimmer in the moonlight. He was wearing old-fashioned coveralls and a cap that had seen better days. "Having some trouble there, friend?" he called out as he approached. I nodded, gesturing to the mess under my hood. "Engine just gave out on me. Don't suppose you could take a look?" The old man peered under the hood, whistling low. "That's a nasty bit of work there, but don't you worry, I've seen worse. Let me get my tools." As he walked back to his truck, I felt a strange sense of unease creep over me. Something about this situation felt off, but I shook it off. After all, what were the chances of a tow truck showing up exactly when I needed one? I should be grateful. The mechanic returned with a battered toolbox and set to work. His hands moved with a sureness that spoke of decades of experience. As he worked, he started to talk, his voice low and rhythmic. "You know, this old road's seen a lot of stories over the years," he said, not looking up from the engine. "A lot of folks broken down, a lot of folks helped out. It's got a spirit of its own, Route 66 does." I nodded, not sure what to say. The old man continued, "You ever heard the story of the ghost rider of Route 66? I shook my head. and he launched into a tale about a motorcyclist who died on this stretch of road back in the 50s. According to the story, he still rides these highways, helping stranded motorists before vanishing without a trace. As he talked, his hands never stopped moving. I watched in amazement as he somehow untangled the mess of my engine, parts seeming to bend and reshape under his touch. It was like watching a magician at work. After what seemed like both hours and mere minutes, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "That should do it," he said, smiling. "Why don't you try starting her up?" Skeptical but hopeful, I climbed back into the cab and turned the key. To my astonishment, the engine roared to life, sounding better than it had in years. I let out a whoop of joy and relief. I jumped down from the cab, ready to shake the old man's hand and ask him how much I owed him. But when I turned around, he was gone. So was his tow truck. I stood there, keys in hand, mouth hanging open. The shoulder where his truck had been parked was empty, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The only sound was the purr of my engine and the whisper of the wind across the desert. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I so tired that I had hallucinated an entire encounter? But no, my engine was running. Whatever had been wrong with it was now fixed. That was real, even if I couldn't explain how it had happened. As I stood there, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. The old man's story about the ghost rider echoed in my mind. But that was just a story, right? Ghost mechanics didn't just show up and fix your truck in the middle of the night. That kind of thing didn't happen in real life. And yet, I climbed back into my truck, my hands shaking slightly as I put it in gear. As I pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened, something I didn't fully understand. The rest of the drive to LA was uneventful, but my mind kept returning to that strange encounter. I found myself scanning the roadside, half expecting to see the old tow truck appear in my rearview mirror. But there was nothing but the empty highway stretching out behind me. When I finally reached my destination and unloaded my cargo, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the local library and asked to see their archives of old newspapers. It took some digging, but eventually I found what I was looking for. A small article from 1958 about a fatal accident on Route 66, just outside Tucumcari. A tow truck driver had been killed while helping a stranded motorist. The article included a grainy photo of the deceased. My blood ran cold as I recognized the face. It was the same man who had fixed my truck. I sat there for a long time, staring at that old newspaper, trying to reconcile what I knew with what I had experienced. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as an exhaustion-induced hallucination, but deep down I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. In the years since that night, I've driven that stretch of Route 66 many times. I've never seen the old mechanic again, but sometimes when the night is clear and the stars are bright, I think I catch a glimpse of headlights in my mirror, there and gone in an instant. And every time I pass the spot where my truck broke down, I give a little nod of thanks. I don't know if it was a ghost, an angel, or just some kind of desert magic that helped me that night. But I do know this. There are more things in this world than we can explain, and sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. So if you're ever driving down Route 66 late at night and you find yourself in trouble, keep an eye out for an old tow truck. And if a kindly mechanic offers to help you, don't be afraid. Just remember to say thank you before he disappears. After all, even ghosts appreciate a little gratitude now and then. I've been driving semis for over 30 years, but nothing prepared me for the night my truck aged a decade in just a few hours. It sounds crazy, I know. Hell, I thought I was losing my mind when it happened. But I swear on my life, every word of the story is true. My name's Frank, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on the long-haul routes. A lot of time alone on dark roads can play tricks on your mind. But this was different. This was real. It started on a run from Phoenix to Dallas, a route I've driven more times than I can count. It was a cool October night, clear skies with a full moon hanging low over the desert. I'd just passed through Lordsburg, New Mexico, when things started to get strange. First, it was just little things. The radio started cutting in and out, playing snippets of old songs I hadn't heard in years. Then the dashboard clock went haywire, spinning forward and backward like it couldn't make up its mind what time it was. I chalked it up to faulty wiring at first. My rig, old Bessie, wasn't exactly fresh off the lot. but she was reliable, and I'd never had problems like this before. As I turned onto a long, straight stretch of highway, a heavy fog rolled in out of nowhere. Now, fog isn't uncommon in these parts, especially at night. But this was different. It was thick, almost purple in color, and it seemed to glow faintly in my headlights. I slowed down, squinting to see the road ahead. The fog swirled around my truck, so dense I could barely see past the hood. That's when I noticed the sound, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My skin prickled with goosebumps. Something about this felt wrong, unnatural. I thought about pulling over, waiting it out. But some instinct told me to keep moving, to get through whatever this was as quickly as possible. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the cab. My headlights flickered, dimming and brightening in an erratic rhythm. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles turning white. "Come on, Bessie," I muttered. "Just a little further." Suddenly there was a flash of light so bright it left spots dancing in my vision. The truck shuddered like it had been hit by a massive wave. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to lose control. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the fog vanished. The strange hum cut out, leaving only the familiar rumble of my engine. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden clarity. The moon shone down on an empty stretch of highway, no sign of the otherworldly fog I'd just driven through. I let out a shaky breath, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. What the hell had just happened? I glanced at the dashboard clock, half expecting it to still be going haywire. Instead, it showed 3:47 a.m., nearly 2 hours later than it should have been. That's when I started noticing other things. The leather of my seat felt different, more worn. The steering wheel had a crack in it that I was sure hadn't been there before. Even the air in the cab smelled different, musty, like old Bessie had been sitting unused for a long time. I pulled over at the next rest stop, my mind racing. As soon as I stepped out of the cab, I knew something was seriously wrong. Old Bessie looked old. Not just the usual wear and tear, but decades older than she had been just hours ago. The once shiny paint was dull and peeling in places. Rust spots had appeared along the fenders and doors. The tires looked worn, tread nearly gone. It was like someone had taken my truck and aged it 10 years in the span of a single night. I circled the truck, running my hands over the worn metal, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't possible. Things like this didn't just happen. I pinched myself hard, half convinced I must be dreaming. But the pain was real. This was real. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. The sound of an approaching vehicle snapped me out of my daze. An old pickup truck pulled into the rest stop, driven by a man who looked to be in his 70s. He got out slowly, eyeing me and my rig. "Everything all right there, son?" he called out. I must have looked a sight, a middle-aged trucker on the verge of a breakdown, standing next to a truck that had seemingly aged overnight. I struggled to find words that wouldn't make me sound completely insane. I'm not sure," I managed finally. "My truck, something's happened to it." The old man ambled over, his eyes widening as he took in old Bessie's condition. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Ain't seen one of these models in years. She's a beaut, even with all the wear. You restore her yourself?" I shook my head, still struggling to process. "No, she was fine just a few hours ago, nearly new. Then there was this fog, and I trailed off, realizing how crazy I must sound. But the old man didn't seem to think I was nuts. Instead, he nodded slowly, a knowing look in his eyes. "Ah," he said softly. "You drove through it, didn't you? The time slip." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "The what?" He sighed, leaning against old Bessie's fender. "The time slip. It's an old legend round these parts. Story goes, there's a stretch of highway where time doesn't work quite right. Folks who drive through it come out changed. Sometimes older, sometimes younger. Some folks say they've seen things that ain't happened yet or relived memories long past." I listened, my mind reeling. It sounded impossible, like something out of a sci-fi novel. But after what I'd just experienced, I was ready to believe just about anything. "But how? Why?" I asked, gesturing helplessly at my aged truck. The old man shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's got something to do with old Indian burial grounds or government experiments gone wrong. Me? I think sometimes the universe just hiccups and we poor souls get caught in the middle of it." He patted old Bessie's hood gently. "Count yourself lucky, son. I've heard tales of folks who went into that fog and never came out at all." A chill ran down my spine at his words. I thought about those 2 missing hours, about how easily it could have been more, how easily I could have disappeared entirely. "What do I do now?" I asked, hating how lost I sounded. The old man smiled kindly. "You keep driving, son. That's all any of us can do. Time has a way of smoothing things out, even things like this. Your truck may be older, but I bet she'll run just fine. Might even have a few new tricks up her sleeve." As if on cue, old Bessie's engine started up, purring like a contented cat. I hadn't left the key in the ignition. The old man chuckled at my startled expression. "See? She's still got some magic in her. You two have been through something special together. Treat her right and she'll never let you down." With that, he tipped his hat and headed back to his pickup. I watched him drive away, still trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened. Finally, I climbed back into old Bessie's cab. The worn leather seat seemed to mold to my body perfectly now, like an old friend welcoming me home. I put her in gear and pulled back onto the highway, the stars wheeling overhead in the vast New Mexico sky. As the miles rolled by, I found myself relaxing. The old man was right. Bessie ran smoother than ever, despite her aged appearance. And there was something comforting about the cab now, a sense of history and shared experience that hadn't been there before. I made it to Dallas without any further incidents, my cargo intact if a little dustier than when I'd started. I've been driving old Bessie ever since. She gets some odd looks at truck stops, and I've had to come up with some creative explanations for her sudden aging. But I wouldn't trade her for the newest rig on the market. Sometimes on long night drives, I find myself watching for that strange, glowing fog. Part of me hopes I never see it again. But another part wonders what other secrets this old highway might be hiding. So if you're ever driving through New Mexico on a moonlit night, and you see a fog rolling in that doesn't look quite right, maybe think twice before driving through. Or if you're feeling brave, go ahead and take that ride. Just don't be surprised if you come out the other side a little different than you went in. After all, out here on the open road, anything can happen. And sometimes the journey changes you in ways you never expected. They say time flies when you're having fun, but at the Twilight Zone truck stop, time doesn't just fly. It runs backwards. I've been a long-haul trucker for 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I experienced that night off Route 66. My name's Eddie, and this is the story of how I lost 12 hours in a place where clocks tick counterclockwise and yesterday is always just around the corner. It was a sweltering August night, the kind where the air feels thick enough to chew. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to LA. My eyes were burning, my back was aching, and I was running on nothing but bad coffee and sheer stubbornness. I just passed through Amarillo when I saw the sign, Twilight Zone Truck Stop, Next Exit. Now, I'm not usually one for cutesy theme stops, but my gas gauge was hovering near empty and my stomach was growling louder than my engine. I figured I'd fuel up, grab a bite, and be back on the road in no time. Boy, was I wrong. I pulled off the highway and followed a winding road that seemed to go on for miles. Just when I was starting to think I'd made a wrong turn, I saw it, a sprawling truck stop that looked like it had been plucked straight out of the 1950s. Neon signs flickered in the darkness, advertising hot coffee and best pie in the universe. A dozen or so big rigs were parked in the lot, their chrome gleaming under the starlight. As I pulled up to the fuel pump, I noticed something odd. The prices listed were impossibly low. 25 cents a gallon. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But no, there it was in glowing red numbers. Must be part of the theme, I muttered to myself as I started fueling up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Once my rig was full, I headed into the diner. The moment I stepped through the door, it was like walking onto a movie set. Red vinyl booths, a jukebox playing Elvis, waitresses in poodle skirts gliding between tables. The air smelled of coffee and apple pie. I took a seat at the counter, still trying to wrap my head around the elaborate decor. A waitress with a name tag that read Peggy sauntered over, notepad in hand. "What'll it be, hon?" she asked, snapping her gum. Coffee, black." And a slice of apple pie, I said, figuring I might as well embrace the theme. As Peggy turned to get my order, my eyes fell on the clock behind the counter. I did a double take. The hands were moving all right, but they were moving backwards. I rubbed my eyes, sure I was hallucinating, but when I looked again, the clock was still ticking away in reverse. I glanced around the diner, looking for other clocks. Every single one was running backwards. "Here you go, sugar," Peggy said, setting down my coffee and pie. "Anything else I can get you?" I hesitated, then decided to bite the bullet. Yeah, can you tell me what's up with the clocks?" Peggy looked at me quizzically. "The clocks? Why, they're keeping time, same as always. But they're running backwards," I pointed out. She laughed, a tinkling sound that seemed to echo strangely in the diner. "Well, of course they are, honey. How else would they keep time?" I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the diner. Something was very, very wrong here. I tried to focus on my food, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The pie tasted amazing, like a memory of childhood summers, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. As I ate, I noticed other oddities. The other patrons in the diner seemed off somehow. Their clothes, their hairstyles, even the way they talked, it was all a mishmash of different eras. A couple in one booth looked straight out of the 1920s, while a group of truckers near the window could have stepped out of a 1970s magazine. And then there were the windows. At first, I thought they were just tinted to keep out the harsh desert sun. But as I looked closer, I realized the darkness outside wasn't natural. Stars wheeled across the sky at impossible speeds, and occasionally, I could swear I saw flashes of daylight gone as quickly as they appeared. I finished my pie in a daze, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here, to get back on the road and put this weird place in my rearview mirror. I flagged down Peggy for the check, trying to keep my voice steady. "How much do I owe you?" She smiled that too bright smile. "Why, it's all taken care of, hon. It's not often we get visitors from your time." My time? What the hell did that mean? I mumbled a thank you and practically bolted for the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard Peggy call out behind me, "Oh, sugar? You might want to check your watch before you go." I froze, then slowly looked down at my wrist. My digital watch, which had been working perfectly fine when I pulled into the truck stop, was now a swirling mass of numbers, the digits flowing backwards and forwards like water. I burst out of the diner, my heart pounding. The parking lot was empty now, my rig the only vehicle in sight. The neon signs flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the pavement. I ran to my truck, fumbling with the keys. As I climbed into the cab, I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was spinning wildly, the hands whirling around the face like a deranged carnival ride. I started the engine and peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. As I raced down the access road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck stop vanish like a mirage. It wasn't until I merged back onto the highway that I dared to breathe. The familiar rumble of my engine and the solid feel of the road beneath my wheels helped ground me. But my relief was short-lived. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something was different. The landscape looked wrong somehow, the familiar landmarks out of place. And the sky, the stars were in all the wrong positions. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. It took 3 tries to unlock it, my fingers clumsy with fear. When I finally managed to pull up the date, I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. It was yesterday, or rather it was the day before I'd left Chicago. Somehow, impossibly, I'd gone back in time. I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life. I must be dreaming or having some kind of mental breakdown from too many hours on the road. But deep down, I knew it was real. The pie I'd eaten still sat warm in my stomach. The smell of the diner's coffee lingered on my clothes, and my watch, now functioning normally again, confirmed the impossible truth. I sat there for a long time trying to decide what to do. Should I try to find my way back to that truck stop? Should I call someone? Who would even believe me? In the end, I did the only thing I could think of. I started driving. I figured if I retraced my route, maybe I'd find my way back to the right time. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I drove through the night, watching the sun rise on a day I'd already lived. When I finally rolled into the truck yard in Chicago, my boss took one look at me and asked if I was feeling all right. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain that I'd lived the next 2 days already? That I'd visited a place where time ran backwards and reality bent like putty? In the end, I didn't try to explain. I took the same load, drove the same route. When I passed the exit for the Twilight Zone truck stop, I kept my eyes firmly on the road ahead. I've been back on that stretch of highway many times since then. I've never seen that exit again. Never found that strange diner where the clocks run backwards. Part of me is relieved, but another part wonders. Sometimes on long night drives when the stars are bright and the road seems to go on forever, I find myself watching for that familiar sign. And I can't help but think about Peggy and that perfect slice of apple pie and the place where yesterday is always just around the corner. So if you're ever driving down Route 66 late at night and you see an exit for a truck stop that wasn't there before, think carefully before you turn off. You might find more than just gas and a hot meal waiting for you. You might find yourself in a place where time doesn't work quite the way you're used to, and if you do decide to stop, well, try the apple pie. It really is the best in the universe. Just don't be surprised if you leave with a lot more questions than answers. I never believed in curses or supernatural phenomena until that fateful cross-country haul when my old war wounds started acting up. It wasn't just a twinge or an ache. It was like reliving every injury I'd ever suffered all at once. And it only happened on one specific stretch of highway. A highway that, as I would soon learn, had a dark and bloody history of its own. My name's Jake, and I've been driving big rigs for nearly 2 decades now. Before that, I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Made it back in one piece, more or less, though not without my fair share of scars, both visible and invisible. It all started on a routine run from Seattle to Miami. I'd made this trip dozens of times before, nothing special about it. But as I crossed into Wyoming on I-80, things took a turn for the weird. It was just past midnight, that time when the world feels empty and anything seems possible. The road stretched out endlessly before me, illuminated by my headlights and the occasional flicker of lightning on the horizon. A storm was brewing, but it was still a ways off. I was about 20 miles east of Rawlins when it hit me, a sudden searing pain in my left shoulder, right where I'd taken a piece of shrapnel back in 08. It was so intense, so unexpected, that I nearly swerved off the road. "What the hell?" I muttered, gritting my teeth against the pain. I'd had flare-ups before, sure, but nothing like this. It felt like the wound had just been inflicted, hot and raw and agonizing. I considered pulling over, but something told me to keep going. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the deadline looming over me. Whatever it was, I pressed on, knuckles white on the steering wheel. As the miles ticked by, the pain spread. My right knee, where I'd torn my ACL during basic training. The long scar on my back from a close call with an IED. Even the spots where I'd had stitches as a kid, all of them burning, aching, throbbing in unison. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I fought to stay focused on the road. The pain was overwhelming, unlike anything I'd experienced since those dark days in the field hospital. It was like my body was remembering every injury it had ever sustained all at once. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Just like that, the pain vanished, leaving me gasping and shaken. I glanced at my GPS. I'd traveled exactly 66 miles since the pain began. I pulled into the next rest stop, my hand shaking as I cut the engine. What the hell had just happened? I'd heard of phantom limb syndrome, but this was something else entirely. It was like my entire body had become a phantom, reliving years of trauma in the span of an hour. As I sat there trying to gather my thoughts, a knock on my window nearly made me jump out of my skin. It was an old man, his face weathered by years under the Wyoming sun. "You all right there, son?" he asked as I rolled down the window. "Saw you come in looking mighty pale." I hesitated, not sure how to explain what had just happened without sounding crazy. But something in the old man's eyes, a mix of concern and knowing, made me spill the whole story. As I talked, his expression grew grave. When I finished, he let out a long, low whistle. "Ain't the first time I've heard a tale like that," he said, leaning against my truck. "That stretch of road you just came down? Locals call it the Wounded Mile, though in your case, seems like it was more than a mile." I stared at him, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "What do you mean?" The old man sighed, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Legend has it that part of I-80 was built over an old battlefield. Not from any war you'd find in the history books, mind. Something older, Native tribes, maybe, or something even before that. They say the land remembers the blood spilled there, and sometimes it makes others remember too. I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. But why me? Why now? I've driven this route plenty of times before. Can't say for sure, he replied, shrugging. Maybe it has something to do with that storm brewing. They say the veil between worlds gets thin when the weather turns, or maybe... He paused, eyeing me thoughtfully. Maybe it's because you've seen battle yourself. Could be the land recognized a kindred spirit, so to speak. I wanted to dismiss it all as superstitious nonsense, but after what I'd just experienced, I wasn't in a position to be skeptical. Has anyone ever not made it through? I asked, not sure I wanted to hear the answer. The old man's face darkened. There's been accidents over the years, more than you'd expect for a straight stretch of highway like that. Can't say for sure if it's related, but... He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. We talked a while longer, the old man sharing more local legends about the Wounded Mile. By the time he wished me well and wandered off, my head was spinning with tales of ghostly warriors and phantom battles playing out on lonely stretches of highway. I spent the rest of that night at the truck stop, too shaken to continue driving. When I finally hit the road again the next morning, I found myself watching the mile markers obsessively, tensing up as I approached the spot where it had all started. But nothing happened. The miles rolled by uneventfully, Wyoming giving way to Nebraska, then Iowa. By the time I reached Chicago, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. Almost. I completed that run without further incident, but the experience haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about what the old man had said about the land remembering, about the veil between worlds growing thin. Over the next few months, I started doing research. I dug into the history of that stretch of I-80, looking for any records of battles or mass casualties. I reached out to other truckers, asking if they'd ever experienced anything strange in that area. Most laughed it off, but a few got real quiet. They'd felt it too, they admitted. Not always the same as what I'd experienced, but something. One guy told me he always heard war drums when he drove through there at night. Another swore she once saw a whole ghostly army marching alongside the highway. I've made that run a dozen times since that night, and it's never happened again. Not to that extent, anyway. But sometimes when I'm passing through that 66-mile stretch, I'll feel a twinge and an old scar, or I'll catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any movement. And I wonder about the layers of history beneath the asphalt, the stories etched into the very bedrock. I think about all the battles fought there, not just the ancient ones, but the personal battles of every traveler who's passed through. The quiet wars we all wage against loneliness, against fatigue, against our own memories. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or curses, but I do believe that some places have power, that some stretches of road hold more than just distance. So if you ever find yourself driving I-80 through Wyoming and you start to feel something strange, a phantom pain, a forgotten ache, a memory you can't quite place, don't panic. Just grip the wheel a little tighter, say a little prayer if that's your thing, and keep on driving. The Wounded Mile remembers, but it lets you pass through. And who knows? Maybe your passage becomes part of its memory too. Another layer in the long, strange history of that haunted highway. Another story for the land to tell when the veil grows thin and the past bleeds into the present. Just do me a favor, will you? If you stop at that rest area just east of Rawlins, and you see an old man with eyes that have seen too much, tell him Jake says hello. Tell him I'm still driving, still remembering, and still wondering about the mysteries that live in the spaces between miles. I've seen a lot of strange things in my years on the road, but nothing quite like that night on Highway 50. They say it's the loneliest road in America, and let me tell you, they're not wrong. But lonely doesn't always mean empty, and sometimes the things you see out there in the darkness make you wish you were truly alone. It was just past midnight when I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. Nothing unusual about that, right? Except I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and these lights seemed to appear out of nowhere like someone had flicked a switch. I adjusted my mirror, squinting at the distant pinpricks of light. They were coming up fast, too fast. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I checked my speed. I was already doing 5 over the limit, eating up the miles on this godforsaken stretch of Nevada asphalt. The lights grew larger, 2 blazing eyes boring into my trailer. I could make out the shape now, sleek, low to the ground, some kind of sports car, all gleaming chrome and predatory curves. It was riding my bumper so close I couldn't even see its license plate. "Back off, buddy," I muttered, tapping my brakes. The truck shuddered as I slowed, but the car behind me didn't budge. It just sat there, inches from my rear fender, like it was attached by some invisible tether. My heart was starting to race. I dealt with my fair share of aggressive drivers, but this was different. There was something unnatural about the way that car moved, how it had appeared so suddenly in this vast emptiness. Just when I thought it might ram me, the sports car swerved into the left lane. I caught a glimpse of dark windows and a blood-red paint job as it rocketed past. The roar of its engine echoed across the desert, and then it was gone, swallowed by the night ahead. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Damn fool's gonna kill somebody driving like that," I said to the empty cab. But even as the words left my mouth, a chill ran down my spine. Something about that car felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, or anywhere. I shook off the feeling and focused on the road. The white lines hypnotized me as the miles ticked by, my eyelids growing heavy. I was considering pulling over for a quick nap when I saw it, headlights in my mirror again. "No way," I whispered, blinking hard. But there it was, that same red sports car, coming up behind me like a bullet. I checked my odometer. I'd covered at least 50 miles since it passed me. There's no way it could be back here, not unless... I didn't want to finish that thought. Instead, I watched, my mouth dry, as the car once again pulled alongside my truck. This time, I got a better look at the driver's window. It was tinted dark, but I could have sworn I saw movement inside, a pale shape where a face should be. The car lingered there for a moment, pacing me. Then, with a rev of its engine that sounded almost like a laugh, it shot forward and disappeared into the darkness. My hands were shaking now. I fumbled for my CB radio, needing to hear a human voice, any voice. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Red. Anybody out there? Over." Static answered me. I tried again, desperation creeping into my voice. "This is Big Red on Highway 50. I've got a situation out here. Anyone copy?" More static, then a burst of garbled sound that might have been words. I strained to make it out, but it faded as quickly as it came. I tossed the radio aside, cursing under my breath. The cab felt smaller suddenly, closing in around me. I cracked the window, letting the cool, desert air rush in. It helped clear my head, but only for a moment, because there they were again, those damn headlights growing larger in my mirror. "This isn't happening," I said, my voice hoarse. But it was happening, right before my eyes. The red sports car materialized out of the gloom, sliding up behind my truck like a phantom. This time I didn't wait. I stomped on the accelerator, pushing my rig to speeds it was never meant to go. The engine roared in protest, but I didn't let up. My eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, watching in horror as the car kept pace effortlessly. We raced through the night, my truck and this impossible pursuer. The desert blurred around us, cacti and scrub brush whipping by in a dizzying smear. I blew past a sign that read "Next services 100 miles" without even slowing down. My heart pounded in time with the thrumming of the engine. Sweat soaked through my shirt, my knuckles white on the wheel. No matter how fast I went, those headlights stayed fixed behind me in unshakable presence. Suddenly, the cab was filled with a harsh, blaring sound. It took me a second to realize it was coming from my own horn. I yanked my hand away from the steering wheel, but the noise continued, screaming into the night. The sports car chose that moment to move. It surged forward, pulling alongside my cab once more. Through the open window, I heard the growl of its engine, deeper and more guttural than any earthly machine. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see, but unable to stop myself. The driver's window of the sports car was down now, revealing the interior. It was empty. No driver, no passenger, just an unfathomable darkness that seemed to swallow all light. A scream built in my throat, but before it could escape, the car accelerated. It pulled in front of my truck, so close I thought I'd ram it for sure. But instead of the crash I was expecting, the sports car simply vanished. 1 second it was there, a solid mass of metal and menace, and the next it was gone, like smoke dispersing in the wind. I blinked, unable to process what I'd just seen. My foot eased off the gas pedal as I struggled to understand. The truck began to slow, the frantic race of the past few minutes catching up with the engine. Steam hissed from under the hood. I'd pushed the old girl too hard. As if in a daze, I guided the rig onto the shoulder and rolled to a stop. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands still gripping the wheel, staring out at the empty highway. The silence was deafening after the chaos of the chase. My ragged breathing and the ticking of the cooling engine were the only sounds. Slowly, I became aware of a faint glow on the horizon. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in pale pinks and golds. I'd made it through the night, though I was damned if I knew how. With shaking hands, I reached for my logbook. I needed to record what had happened, to put it down in black and white before I could convince myself it was just a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But as I flipped open the book, something fluttered to the floor of the cab. I leaned down to pick it up, my blood running cold as I realized what it was. A photograph, creased and faded, showing a red sports car, the same car that had haunted me all night. I turned it over with trembling fingers. On the back, in faded ink, was a message. "See you next time, driver." A horn blared, making me jump. I looked up to see a pickup truck rolling past, its driver giving me a curious look. In the growing light of day, the desert stretched out around me, empty and indifferent. There was no sign of the sports car, no evidence of the nightmarish chase. But I had the photo in my hand, tangible proof that it hadn't been a dream. I stared at it, a chill settling deep in my bones as I realized the truth. My encounter on Highway 50 wasn't over. It was just the beginning. With a shaky sigh, I tucked the photo into my breast pocket. The engine had cooled enough to risk starting it up again. As I pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the vast expanse of the American West, that red sports car was waiting for night to fall, waiting for an empty road, waiting for me. I've been driving truck for 30 years now, and I've seen my share of weird stuff. But that night on Highway 50, that's the one that sticks with me. The one that makes me think twice about driving after midnight. The one that has me checking my mirrors, not just for other vehicles, but for things that shouldn't be there at all. Because out there on the lonely highways, in the dark spaces between towns, there are things that defy explanation. Things that hunt in the night, wearing the skin of ordinary objects. And sometimes, if you're not careful, those things find you. So if you're ever driving down a deserted road and you see a red sports car in your rearview mirror, do yourself a favor. Don't slow down. Don't speed up. Just keep driving and pray for daylight, because once it starts following you, it might never stop. As for me, I'm still out here rolling down these highways. But I've got that photo tucked away in my cab, a constant reminder of the night I learned that some races can't be won. Some pursuers can't be shaken, and some stories don't end just because the sun comes up. So keep an eye on your mirrors, fellow drivers. And remember, on the loneliest roads, you're never truly alone. I've hauled cargo through blizzards, navigated hairpin turns with a full load, and even outrun a tornado once. But nothing in my 20 years of long-haul trucking could have prepared me for what I encountered on Sawback Pass that moonless October night. The CB crackled to life as I started the winding ascent. "Big rig, this is Mountain Mike, you copy?" I grabbed the handset. "Read you loud and clear, Mike. What's the word?" "Storm's rolling in faster than expected. They're closing the pass at midnight. You better hustle if you want to make it through." I checked my watch. 10:47 p.m. Plenty of time, or so I thought. "Roger that, Mike. I'm about 20 minutes out from the summit. Should be smooth sailing from there. Watch yourself up there, big rig. Been some strange reports lately. Over and out." I didn't think to ask what kind of reports. That was my first mistake. The road narrowed as I climbed higher. Sheer rock faces looming on one side, a dizzying drop on the other. My headlights cut through a thickening fog, illuminating the reflective eyes of small creatures darting into the underbrush. I'd just rounded a particularly nasty switchback when I saw it, a massive shape lumbering across the road about 100 yards ahead. I hit the brakes, the truck's air horn blaring a warning. The figure stopped, turning towards me. In the harsh glare of my high beams, I could make out the unmistakable silhouette of a bear. But something was off. This bear was huge, easily twice the size of any I'd seen before. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over my cab. For a moment, we just stared at each other, man and beast, neither willing to give ground. Then, with a grunt that sounded almost human, it dropped to all fours and lumbered off into the woods. My hands were shaking as I put the truck back in gear. That bear had been unnaturally large, its movements too deliberate. Something wasn't right up here. I'd barely gone another mile when my radio squawked again. "Big Rig, you still with us? Storm's picking up speed. How's your progress?" I keyed the mic. "Just past marker 37, Mike. Should crest the summit in 10. Everything's fit." The words died in my throat. There, in my side mirror, I saw movement. A flash of gray fur, a gleam of yellow eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. "You cut out there, Big Rig? Say again?" I swallowed hard. Thought I saw something in my mirror, probably just a deer. "Roger that. Keep your eyes peeled." "Out." The fog was getting thicker now, tendrils of it curling around my truck like grasping fingers. I flicked on my fog lamps, but they did little to penetrate the murk. The temperature gauge on my dash was dropping rapidly, frost forming at the edges of my windshield. That's when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was joined by another, then another, a chilling chorus that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Wolves. But wolves didn't sound like that. These howls were deeper, more resonant, as if they were coming from something much larger than any wolf had a right to be. I pressed down on the accelerator, urging my rig to climb faster. The engine strained against the steep grade, black smoke belching from the exhaust stacks. I was less than 5 miles from the summit now. If I could just make it over the top, I'd have a straight shot down the other side. A dark shape darted across the road ahead, too fast for me to make out clearly. Then another, and another. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel as I leaned forward, peering into the swirling mist. Suddenly they were there. Wolves, just as I'd feared. But these were monsters. Each one was the size of a small car with matted gray fur and eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in my headlights. They moved with an eerie intelligence, spreading out across the road to block my path. I laid on the horn, hoping the noise would scatter them. Instead, they seemed to take it as a challenge. The largest of the pack, a scarred brute with one mangled ear, let out a bone-chilling howl. As one, the wolves began to advance. "Mayday, mayday!" I shouted into the radio. "This is Big Rig on Sawback Pass. I've got a situation up here. Need immediate assistance." Only static answered me. I was on my own. The wolves were closing in now, their massive paws eating up the distance between us. I could see saliva dripping from yellow fangs, hear the low growls rumbling in their chests. These weren't normal animals. There was a cold intelligence in their eyes, a calculated hunger that went beyond mere predatory instinct. I had a split second to make a decision. Stopping meant certain death. There was only one way out of this. I gritted my teeth and stomped on the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward with a roar, bearing down on the pack. Most of the wolves scattered, but the big one, the leader, stood his ground, lips pulled back in a snarl. "Move, damn you!" I shouted. But the wolf didn't budge. At the last possible second, I cranked the wheel hard to the right. The truck's tires screamed in protest as we sideswiped the massive animal. I felt the impact reverberate through the cab, heard the crunch of metal and the yelp of pain. For a terrifying moment, the truck teetered on 2 wheels, threatening to topple over the edge of the cliff. By some miracle, the rig slammed back down onto all 18 wheels. I fought to keep it under control, the trailer fishtailing wildly behind me. Sparks flew as the guardrail scraped along the passenger side, the thin metal barrier the only thing keeping us from plummeting into the abyss. I didn't dare look in my mirrors. I could hear the wolves behind me, their howls filled with rage and bloodlust. The sound spurred me on, pushing my poor truck to limits it was never meant to reach. The summit loomed ahead, a black silhouette against the storm-racked sky. Just a little further, I told myself. Just a little more. We crested the top of the pass in a shower of gravel and screeching metal. For a brief moment, I thought I'd made it. Then I saw what lay ahead. The entire pack was there, waiting for me. Dozens of them, their eyes gleaming with an otherworldly hunger. They had herded me here, I realized, with growing horror. This had been their plan all along. Time seemed to slow as I took in the scene. The wolves tensed to spring. The long descent ahead, treacherous even in good conditions. The storm, now in full fury, lashing the mountainside with wind and sleet. In that frozen moment, I made my choice. I wasn't going to die up here, not like this. I yanked the wheel hard to the left, aiming for the narrow gap between the wolves and the cliff edge. The truck responded sluggishly, too much momentum to turn quickly. I felt the trailer begin to jackknife behind me. The world tilted crazily as the cab went up on two wheels again. Through my driver's side window, I could see straight down the mountain, a dizzying drop that seemed to go on forever. The wolves lunged, massive bodies hurtling through the air towards me. I closed my eyes, certain this was the end. The truck gave one final shudder, and then we were through. I opened my eyes to see the road stretching out before me, the wolves falling behind as I picked up speed on the downslope. Their howls of frustration echoed off the mountainside, sending chills down my spine. I didn't slow down until I reached the bottom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As soon as I hit flat ground, I pulled over and got out on shaky legs. The truck was a mess. Deep claw marks scored the cab, the passenger side crumpled where I'd sideswiped the wolf. The trailer was dented and scraped, but somehow still attached. It was a miracle we'd made it down in one piece. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath, my radio crackled to life. "Big Rig, this is Mountain Mike. You there? Been trying to reach you for an hour?" I picked up the handset with trembling fingers. "I'm here, Mike. Made it through, but you're not going to believe what happened up there." There was a long pause before Mike responded. "You saw them, didn't you? The wolves?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "You knew about them?" "There have been stories for years," Mike said softly. "Truckers, hikers, hunters, all talking about monsters in the pass. Nobody believed them, of course, wrote it off as hallucinations, altitude sickness. But those of us who live in these mountains, we know the truth." I looked back up at Sawback Pass, now shrouded in mist and shadow. For a moment I thought I saw movement up there, massive shapes prowling along the ridgeline, watching, waiting. "What are they?" I whispered. "Nobody knows for sure," Mike replied. "Some say they're mutations from an old government experiment. Others think there's something older, something that's always been in these mountains. All I know is, you're lucky to be alive." I climbed back into my cab, wincing at the claw marks on the door. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the mountain pass. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Lucky." I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. I had a delivery to make, after all. But I knew one thing for certain. I'd never take this route again. Some roads are better left untraveled, some passes better left uncrossed. And some wolves are better left to howl in the night, unheard and unseen by those of us just passing through. You ever have one of those moments where your whole life hinges on a single decision? For me, it was whether or not to believe a toothless old man at a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere. Turns out sometimes the craziest warnings are the ones you should heed the most. It was just past midnight when I pulled into Crossroads Fill-Up, my rig's fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. The place was a relic, all rust-streaked pumps and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. But when you're running on fumes in the backwoods of West Virginia, you don't exactly have the luxury of being picky. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and something else, something older and mustier, like wet leaves and decay. A sign on the door proclaimed "Open 24 hours" in faded red letters, but the place had the feel of somewhere time had long since forgotten. The bell above the door gave a half-hearted jingle as I stepped inside. The interior was no better than the exterior, dingy linoleum floors, shelves stocked with dusty cans and sun-bleached snack packages. Behind the counter stood the oldest man I'd ever seen, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes cloudy with cataracts. "Evening," I said, fishing out my wallet. "Fill up on pump 3, please." The old man didn't move. He just stared at me, his roomy eyes narrowing. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel in a blender. "You heading east on Route 60? I nodded, a little taken aback. "That's right, got a delivery to make in Charleston by morning." He shook his head slowly, a gesture full of sadness and something that might have been fear. "Not tonight, you don't. Not if you want to see another sunrise." I blinked, sure I'd misheard him. "Excuse me?" The old man leaned forward, his gnarled hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Route 60's cursed tonight. Has been every year on this date for nigh on 5 decades. You take that road, you ain't coming back." A chill ran down my spine despite the stuffy heat of the store. I'd heard my share of local legends and trucker superstitions over the years. But something in the old man's voice made this feel different. There was a certainty there, a weight of experience that was hard to dismiss. Still, I had a job to do. "Look, I appreciate the warning, but I've got a schedule to keep. Is there some kind of construction going on? Accident, maybe?" The old man's laugh was a dry, rattling sound. "Ain't no construction gonna save you from what's out there. You want my advice? Park your rig right here and wait till morning. Hell, sleep in the cab if you have to. Just don't go east. Not tonight." I stood there for a moment, torn between my rational mind and the nagging feeling in my gut that said maybe, just maybe, this wasn't some senile old-timer spinning yarns. But then I thought about my delivery deadline, about the bonus I'd lose if I was late. I couldn't afford to take ghost stories seriously, no matter how convincing they seemed. "Thanks for the concern," I said, sliding a couple 20s across the counter. "But I really need to get going. Pump 3, please." The old man stared at the money for a long moment before slowly reaching out to take it. As he rang up the sale, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your funeral, son. But don't say I didn't warn you." I hurried out of the store, suddenly eager to put as much distance between myself and Crossroads Phillip as possible. As I fueled up the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I looked back at the store, the old man was standing at the window, his face half in shadow. He raised one gnarled hand in what might have been a wave or maybe a final warning. Back on the road, I tried to put the whole unsettling encounter out of my mind. I cranked up the radio, letting the familiar twang of late-night country music wash over me. But as I approached the turn onto Route 60, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of black disappearing into the darkness. Thick forest pressed in on both sides, the trees seeming to lean over the highway like grasping fingers. I shook my head, annoyed at myself for letting an old man's ramblings get to me. I was about 10 miles in when I first noticed something odd. The temperature gauge on my dash was dropping rapidly, the needle edging towards the blue even though the night was warm and muggy. I fiddled with the AC controls, but nothing changed. Within minutes, I could see my breath frosting in the air. That's when the radio cut out, replaced by a burst of static so loud it made me jump. I tried other stations, but it was all the same. Just white noise and the occasional snatch of what sounded like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My hands were sweating on the wheel now, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirrors. The forest seemed to press in closer, the shadows between the trees deeper than they should be. More than once, I could have sworn I saw movement out there. Dark shapes flitting between the trunks, always just at the edge of my vision. I was considering turning back when I saw the figure in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was standing on 2 legs. It was roughly man-shaped, but too tall, too thin. Its limbs were too long, joints bent at impossible angles. And its face, God, its face was just wrong. A twisted parody of human features that made my stomach churn. I laid on the horn, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, swaying slightly, those inhuman eyes fixed on my approaching truck. At the last second, I swerved, the rig fishtailing as I fought to keep control. I rocketed past the figure, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. In my side mirror, I saw it turn, tracking my movement with that eyeless face. And then, impossibly, it began to run. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, but it was fast, so fast. Within seconds, it was alongside my trailer, those elongated fingers scraping along the metal with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. I floored it, pushing my poor truck to speeds it was never meant to reach. The engine roared in protest, black smoke belching from the exhaust stacks. But no matter how fast I went, that thing kept pace, its twisted limbs eating up the distance between us. Suddenly, there were more of them. Emerging from the woods, loping alongside the road, dozens of those nightmarish figures, all converging on my truck. They moved in perfect unison, like a pack of predators herding their prey. I was going nearly 100 miles an hour now, taking curves at speeds that threatened to topple the rig. But I knew with a bone-deep certainty that if I slowed down, if I stopped for even a second, those things would be on me. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I saw the bridge ahead. It was an old iron affair, spanning a deep gorge. Even from a distance, I could see that it was falling apart. Whole sections of guardrail missing, the road surface cracked and pitted. I had a split second to make a decision. I could try to stop, to turn around and face whatever those things were, or I could gun it and pray the bridge held. I chose the bridge. The truck hit the span doing 90, the whole structure shuddering under the impact. I heard metal groan, felt the deck start to give way beneath me. Behind me, those things poured onto the bridge, their weight only hastening its collapse. I was halfway across when the cables started to snap. The sound was like gunshots, the bridge swaying wildly with each failure. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, my foot pressed to the floor as if I could will the truck to go faster. The far side was just ahead, tantalizingly close, but the bridge was falling away behind me, a chain reaction of destruction racing to overtake me. I felt the back tires lose traction as the road disappeared beneath them. For a moment I was airborne, the truck suspended over the chasm. I closed my eyes, certain this was the end. Then, with a bone-jarring impact, the front tires hit solid ground. The truck slammed down onto the far side, the trailer barely making it as the last of the bridge fell away. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I drove through the rest of the night in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. It wasn't until the first rays of dawn began to streak the sky that I finally pulled over, my hands shaking too badly to grip the wheel. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun rise over the mountains. When I finally felt steady enough to drive again, I turned the truck around and headed back the way I'd come. I found Crossroads Phillip just where I'd left it. The old man was still behind the counter as if he hadn't moved all night. When he saw me, he just nodded, a sad smile creasing his weathered face. "Told you it was cursed," he said simply. "I never did make that delivery to Charleston. Lost my job over it, in fact. But sitting here now, gray-haired and wrinkled myself, I know I made the right choice. Because sometimes the real curse isn't the monster on the road. It's not listening when someone tries to warn you about it. They say your sense of smell is the strongest trigger for memories. But what happens when that smell is a warning from a past you can't remember? I found out the hard way on a lonely stretch of highway in the dead of night with nothing but miles of asphalt ahead and a ghost of smoke that wouldn't let me forget. It started on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd just picked up a load in Tucson, bound for Sacramento. The sun was setting as I pulled out of the depot, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. I had 800 miles ahead of me, and I was looking forward to the solitude of the open road. The first few hours were uneventful. I settled into that zen-like state that long-haul drivers know well, where the white lines blend together and time seems to stretch out like taffy. The radio kept me company, a mix of classic rock and late-night talk shows. It was sometime after midnight when I first noticed it. A faint whiff of smoke there and gone so quickly I thought I'd imagined it. I glanced at my dashboard, checking for any warning lights, but everything was normal. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably just some residual smell from my last cigarette break. But it came again, stronger this time. Acrid and thick, it filled the cab for a moment before dissipating. I felt my heart rate pick up, that primal part of my brain screaming danger. I pulled over to the shoulder, killed the engine, and did a thorough check of the truck. Nothing. No smoke, no fire, not even a hint of overheating. I stood there for a moment, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my arms. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and silent. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of a town, maybe 20 miles ahead. I decided to push on. If there really was a problem, better to reach civilization than be stranded out here. Back in the cab, I cranked up the AC and tried to focus on the road. But now that I'd noticed it, the smell seemed to be getting stronger. It would come in waves, sometimes so faint I doubted my own senses, other times so strong it made my eyes water. I found myself gripping the wheel tighter, my knuckles white with tension. Every few minutes I'd check my mirrors, half expecting to see smoke billowing from the trailer. But there was never anything there, just the empty road behind me. As the miles ticked by, the smell began to trigger something in me. Flashes of memory, gone almost before I could grasp them. The crackle of flames, the sound of screaming, a feeling of intense heat, of choking, suffocating smoke. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I'd never been in a fire, never had any trauma involving smoke. So why did these phantom sensations feel so real, so terrifyingly familiar? The glow of the town was getting closer now, a beacon of normality in this increasingly surreal night. I decided that as soon as I reached it, I'd find a mechanic, someone who could check out the truck and put my mind at ease. That's when I saw her. She appeared so suddenly in my headlights that I nearly swerved off the road. A woman standing on the shoulder, her arm outstretched in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. As I flew past, I caught a glimpse of her face, young, pretty, with an expression of desperate urgency. I hit the brakes, the truck protesting as I brought it to a hard stop. In my side mirror, I could see the woman running towards me, her long hair streaming behind her. The smell of smoke was overwhelming now, filling the cab, making my eyes sting. But as I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open that door, not to let whatever was out there in. The woman reached the passenger side, her hands pressing against the window. Her mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind her on the empty highway, I could see lights. Not the headlights of an oncoming car, but a flickering orange glow. The unmistakable light of flames. My hand was on the door handle. Every fiber of my being torn between the instinct to help and the overwhelming sense of wrongness that permeated the air. The woman's face was pressed against the glass now, her eyes wide with fear or something else entirely. In that moment of indecision, everything changed. The flames I'd seen in the distance suddenly erupted around the truck, a wall of fire springing up from the asphalt as if the road itself had ignited. The heat was intense, even through the closed windows, and I could hear the crackle and roar of the inferno. I turned back to the woman, but she was gone. In her place was something else, a figure blackened and charred, more ash than flesh, its mouth open in a silent scream. As I watched in horror, it began to disintegrate, pieces flaking off and carried away by the wind. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, crashing through the wall of fire. In my mirrors, I could see the flames receding, the burned figure slowly fading from view. But the smell of smoke remained, thicker than ever, choking me, filling my lungs until I could barely breathe. Somehow I made it to the town. I pulled into the first well-lit area I saw, a 24-hour diner with a few semis parked outside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. When I finally managed to open the door and stumble out, I gulped in the cool night air like a drowning man. "You all right there, buddy?" A voice startled me. An older man, another trucker by the look of him, was watching me with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, but instead of words, a sob escaped. And then another. Before I knew it, I was sitting on the ground, my back against the truck's tire, crying like I hadn't since I was a kid. The older trucker didn't say anything. He just sat down next to me and waited. When I finally got myself under control, he offered me a cigarette. I took it with shaking hands, grateful for the familiar ritual. "Want to talk about it?" he asked after I'd taken a few drags. I didn't know where to start. How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced? I'd sound crazy. Hell, maybe I was crazy. But something in the man's kind eyes made me want to try. I think I died tonight," I said finally. "Or maybe I died a long time ago and just remembered it." The old trucker nodded slowly, as if this wasn't the strangest thing he'd ever heard. "Route 10? He asked. I stared at him, shocked. "How did you know?" He sighed, taking a long drag on his own cigarette. "It happens sometimes out there in the desert. Time gets thin, things bleed through." "Things," I echoed. "Memories, past lives, moments that got stuck playing over and over." He looked at me thoughtfully. "You smell smoke?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Thought so. It was a bad accident back in the '86. Tanker truck full of gasoline, driver fell asleep at the wheel, hit another semi head-on. The whole thing went up like a Roman candle." He paused, his eyes distant. "They say a woman stopped to help, got caught in the blaze. Highway patrol found 3 bodies burned beyond recognition." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Why would I remember that? Why would I see it? The old trucker shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe you were there. Maybe you were one of them, or maybe the desert just decided you needed to see it, to remember it for them." He stood up, groaning as his joints popped. "Whatever the reason, you made it through. Not everyone does." He offered me a hand, helping me to my feet. "My advice, get some rest. When you're ready to move on, take the northern route. It's longer, but safer." I nodded, suddenly exhausted. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than I ever had before. The old trucker just waved as he walked away. "Stay safe out there," he called over his shoulder. "And if you ever smell smoke again, well, maybe it's time to consider a new line of work." I watched him go, feeling simultaneously drained and oddly at peace. When I climbed back into my cab, the smell of smoke was gone, replaced by the familiar scents of leather and diesel. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I found myself taking the exit for the northern route without even really thinking about it. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I don't know if what I experienced that night was real or some kind of hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But I do know this. Every time I pass a fiery crash on the highway now, I say a little prayer. Not just for the victims, but for the ghosts they leave behind. The ones that linger on lonely stretches of road, waiting for someone to remember them. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a whiff of smoke in my cab. But now, instead of fear, I feel a strange sort of comfort. A reminder that even on the loneliest highway, we're never truly alone. I've hauled everything from livestock to liquid nitrogen, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. The night I delivered to a place that shouldn't exist, guarded by things that couldn't possibly be real. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if it was all just a dream. But then I feel the scar on my left hand, and I know some nightmares are all too real. It started like any other job. A call from dispatch, coordinates for a pickup, and strict instructions not to open the cargo. Nothing unusual there. Plenty of companies value their privacy. But something about this one felt off from the get-go. For starters, the pickup point was in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. Not even a town nearby, just an unmarked warehouse sitting alone in the desert like some kind of mirage. As I backed my rig up to the loading dock, I noticed the guards. They wore black tactical gear, faces hidden behind tinted visors. Standard stuff for a high-security gig, but their movements were off, too fluid, too precise. Like watching a nature documentary of predators stalking their prey. I tried to shake off the feeling as they loaded my trailer. The cargo was a single container about the size of a small car, sealed tight and humming with some kind of internal power source. I didn't ask questions. In this line of work, sometimes it's better not to know. The real strangeness started once I hit the road. My GPS went haywire, the screen flickering between my actual location and somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The radio picked up nothing but static, occasionally broken by bursts of sound that might have been voices if voices could speak in frequencies that made my teeth ache. As night fell, the desert seemed to close in around me. The stars above were too bright, too numerous, forming constellations I'd never seen before. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes darting across the road or lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there but sand and scrub brush. I'd been driving for hours when I saw the lights on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a town, but as I got closer, I realized it was a single massive complex. High walls topped with razor wire surrounded a cluster of windowless buildings. Floodlights bathed the whole place in harsh, unnatural brightness. This was my destination, the high-security facility I'd been contracted to deliver to. As I approached the main gate, my mouth went dry. The guard post was manned, but not by anything I'd call human. The creature that stepped out to meet me was tall, easily 7 feet, with limbs too long and joints that bent in ways that made my stomach churn. Its skin was a pale, almost translucent gray, stretched tight over a frame that was unmistakably alien. But it was the eyes that really got me. Huge, black, and multifaceted like some kind of insect. I froze, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to floor it, to get as far away from this place as possible. But before I could act, the creature spoke. Its voice was inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. "Identification and cargo manifest, please." The words were clear, but accompanied by a background hum that made my vision blur. Somehow I managed to fumble my credentials out of the glove compartment with shaking hands. As I held them out the window, I noticed dark shapes moving in the shadows beyond the gate. More of these things, watching silently. The guard, if you could call it that, took my papers with long, spindly fingers. It studied them for a moment, those huge eyes reflecting the cab's interior like black mirrors. Then it nodded, a jerky motion that was almost, but not quite, human. Proceed to loading bay 7. Do not deviate from the marked path. Do not attempt to observe or record any activity within the facility. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination. The gate swung open with a low hum of energy. As I pulled through, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just crossed some kind of threshold, not just into a secure facility, but into a world where the rules I knew no longer applied. The marked path turned out to be a strip of glowing blue material embedded in the asphalt. It wound between massive structures that defied architectural logic, all odd angles and surfaces that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I kept my eyes firmly on the path, trying to ignore the movement I could see in my peripheral vision. Things scuttling across the walls of the buildings, things flying between the structures on wings that should not have been able to support their bulk, things that had no business existing in any sane universe. Loading Bay 7 turned out to be a cavernous space that could have swallowed my truck 10 times over. As I backed in, I saw more of the alien guards positioned around the perimeter. They stood unnaturally still, only their eyes moving as they tracked my progress. A team of what I assumed were human workers approached my trailer. They wore hermetically sealed suits that covered them from head to toe, with darkened faceplates that revealed nothing of the people inside. They worked with practiced efficiency, unsealing the container and transferring its contents to awaiting transport. I caught a glimpse of what was inside, a swirling, opalescent liquid that seemed to move with a life of its own. I quickly looked away, remembering the guard's warning. As the workers finished up, one of them approached my cab. When he spoke, his voice was distorted by his suit's speakers. "You'll need to come with us for decontamination before you leave." I started to protest. No one had said anything about decontamination, but the word termination echoed in my mind. I nodded mutely and climbed down from the cab. They led me to a small, featureless room. The door sealed behind me with a hiss, and a fine mist began to spray from nozzles in the ceiling. It smelled like ozone and something else, something alien and vaguely medicinal. The mist grew thicker until I could barely see my hand in front of my face. That's when the pain started. It felt like my skin was on fire, like every nerve ending was being scraped raw. I might have screamed. I don't remember. What I do remember is the visions, flashes of other worlds, of creatures too vast and terrible to comprehend, cities that spiraled into dimensions that shouldn't exist, and through it all a sense of something watching, something so ancient and powerful that merely brushing against its consciousness was enough to drive a person mad. When it was over, I found myself on my hands and knees, gasping for breath. My skin felt too tight, like it didn't quite fit anymore. And on my left hand, where my class ring usually sat, was a mark. A complex symbol that seemed to shift and change when I looked at it directly. The suited figures returned, helping me to my feet. They led me back to my truck without a word. As I climbed into the cab, still shaky and disoriented, one of them finally spoke. "You were never here. You delivered nothing. You saw nothing. If anyone asks, you spent the night at a rest stop outside of Reno, understand?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I pulled out of the loading bay, I caught one last glimpse of the facility in my mirrors. For a moment, it seemed to shimmer, like a mirage in the desert heat. Then it was gone, leaving nothing but empty sand where a massive complex had stood just moments before. I drove through the rest of the night in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. By the time the sun rose, bathing the desert in warm, normal light, I'd almost convinced myself it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel, my brain conjuring up wild images from too many late-night sci-fi movies. But then I looked down at my left hand and saw the mark. Still there, still shifting in ways that hurt my eyes if I looked too long. I've never spoken about that night, not to anyone. Who would believe me? Hell, half the time I don't believe it myself. But sometimes on long hauls through the desert night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my mirror. A flicker of light on the horizon, a shape that doesn't quite fit in this world. And I'll feel the mark on my hand burn just for a moment. And I'll wonder, what exactly did I deliver that night? And more importantly, what did I let into this world? I don't take jobs in Nevada anymore. Some roads are better left untraveled, some deliveries better left unmade. And some questions are better left unanswered. But on quiet nights, when the road stretches out empty before me, I can't help but think about that facility, about the things I saw there. And I wonder if somewhere out in the vast desert night they're thinking about me too. They say you see your life flash before your eyes when you're about to die. But as I barreled towards the edge of Dead Man's Drop, brakes screaming and useless beneath my foot, all I saw was the long line of crosses dotting the roadside, each one a silent testament to a driver who'd taken this curve too fast, who'd trusted their rig one time too many. I was about to join their ranks, another victim of the most notorious stretch of highway this side of the Rockies. But fate, it turns out, has a twisted sense of humor. It was supposed to be a routine run, Sacramento to Seattle, a route I'd driven 100 times before, but as any trucker will tell you, the moment you get complacent is the moment the road decides to throw you a curveball. I'd been on the road for about 10 hours, the sun long since set behind the mountains. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting everything in a silvery glow that made the world feel slightly unreal. I was making good time, my rig eating up the miles with the steady determination of a marathon runner. As I approached the foothills of the Cascade Range, I felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread that always came with this part of the journey. Dead Man's Drop was coming up, a series of sharp switchbacks that curved around the edge of a cliff, with a sheer drop of over 1,000 feet on one side and a wall of solid rock on the other. I'd lost count of how many times I'd navigated this stretch, but it never got easier. The highway department had tried everything to make it safer: guardrails, warning signs, even talks of blasting a tunnel through the mountain. But nothing seemed to stop the accidents. It was like the place was cursed, hungry for blood and steel. I downshifted as I hit the first curve, feeling the weight of my load shift behind me. Everything seemed normal at first. The engine growled as I guided the truck through the turn, my hands sure on the wheel. But as I straightened out and prepared for the next switchback, I felt it. A slight shudder running through the rig, a vibration that didn't belong. I tapped the brakes, more out of instinct than anything else. The pedal went straight to the floor, offering no resistance. My heart leapt into my throat as I pumped it frantically, praying for some kind of response. Nothing. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice sounding strange and distant in the sudden silence. I'd killed the radio miles back, not wanting any distractions on this stretch. I yanked the handbrake, but it was like trying to stop a runaway train with a piece of string. The truck kept barreling forward, picking up speed as the road tilted downward into the next curve. My mind raced, years of training battling with pure animal panic. I could see the next switchback approaching, the guardrail glinting in my headlights like a silvery thread separating me from oblivion. I had seconds to make a decision. I could try to take the turn and pray the truck didn't flip, or I could aim for the runaway truck ramp I knew was coming up. The ramp was designed for situations just like this. A long stretch of upward-sloping gravel meant to slow a vehicle when brakes failed. But at the speed I was going, I wasn't sure even that would be enough. The choice was made for me as I hit the curve. The trailer began to swing out, the weight of my cargo working against me. I felt the left wheels leave the ground, the whole world tilting as the truck threatened to roll. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw the line of crosses flash by, each one a grim reminder of what waited for me at the bottom of that cliff. I thought of my family, my wife, my kids. Would they understand that I'd done everything I could? Would they ever know what really happened on this godforsaken stretch of road? Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the moment passed. The truck slammed back down onto all 18 wheels, shuddering with the impact. I was through the curve, but the danger was far from over. The next switchback was approaching fast, and I knew there was no way I'd make it. The runaway ramp loomed ahead, my last chance at survival. I wrenched the wheel to the right, feeling the truck resist as I forced it off the main road. The second the tires hit the gravel, it was like I'd driven into wet cement. The truck shuddered violently, the trailer threatening to jackknife behind me. I held on for dear life as we shot up the ramp, gravel spraying in all directions. The world outside became a blur, the engine roaring in protest as we climbed higher and higher. Just when I thought we might actually make it, I felt the truck begin to slide sideways. Time slowed again as I felt the rig start to tip. This was it, I thought. This was how it ended. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. That never came. Instead, I felt a sudden jolt and then... nothing. The roar of the engine cut off abruptly, leaving behind a ringing silence. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I opened my eyes. The truck was tilted at an impossible angle, balanced precariously on the edge of the ramp. Through my driver's side window, I could see straight down the mountain, a dizzying drop that made my stomach lurch. But we weren't falling. Somehow, miraculously, we'd stopped. With shaking hands, I unclipped my seatbelt and carefully opened the door. The night air hit me like a slap, cool and crisp and so beautifully alive. I climbed out onto the tilted cab, my boots scrabbling for purchase on the smooth metal. And that's where I was when the state trooper found me an hour later, sitting on top of my cab, laughing and crying in equal measure. The look on his face when he crested the ramp and saw my truck defying gravity, I'll never forget it as long as I live. It took them most of the night to get my rig safely down from that ramp. As I watched the tow trucks work, the trooper filled me in on what had happened. Turned out I wasn't the first driver to lose their brakes on Dead Man's Drop that week. There'd been a recall on a certain brake line component, but the notice hadn't reached everyone yet. "You're one lucky son of a gun," the trooper said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Another foot and you'd have gone right over the edge." I nodded, still not quite believing it myself. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I found myself walking along the edge of the highway, looking at those crosses I'd seen so many times before. Each one had a name, a date, lives cut short on this unforgiving stretch of road. I'd come so close to joining them, to becoming just another cautionary tale for drivers to whisper about on long night hauls. As I stood there, a gust of wind kicked up, rustling through the grass and wildflowers that had grown up around the memorials. For a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something on that wind. Voices, maybe. Laughing, cheering. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly walked back to where the trooper was waiting. But as we drove down the mountain, my truck secured behind a tow vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been given a second chance. That somehow, those who hadn't been as lucky as me had reached out and kept my rig from tipping that final fatal inch. I don't drive trucks anymore. After that night, I knew my days on the road were done. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full, I'll drive up to the overlook near Dead Man's Drop. I'll stand there, looking out over the valley, and I'll think about how close I came to becoming just another cross on the side of the road. And I'll whisper a quiet thank you to whatever forces were watching over me that night. To the luck, or fate, or restless spirits that decided it wasn't my time to join them. Because sometimes, even on the deadliest road, miracles can happen. And sometimes the difference between life and death is as thin as a whisper on the wind. The dashboard clock blinked 2:37 a.m. as my headlights cut through the inky darkness. I'd driven this stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada 100 times. But something felt off tonight. The usual comforting hum of my rig's engine seemed muffled, distant. Even the familiar constellations above looked wrong somehow, like someone had rearranged the stars while I wasn't looking. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of an 18-hour haul. Just a few more miles to the truck stop in Ely, then I could grab some shut-eye before finishing the run to Salt Lake City. I reached for my thermos, grimacing as lukewarm coffee hit my tongue. That's when I saw her. A flash of white in my high beams. A woman standing stock still in the middle of the westbound lane. "Jesus Christ," I shouted, jamming my foot on the brake pedal. Tires screamed against asphalt as 40 tons of steel and cargo fought momentum. The cab shuddered violently. I cranked the wheel, desperate to avoid the figure that grew larger in my windshield with each passing second. My rig fishtailed, nearly jackknifing as I brought it to a stop mere feet from where she stood. Heart pounding, I fumbled with my seatbelt and threw open the door, nearly falling in my haste to check on her. "Ma'am, are you all right? What the hell are you doing out here?" I shouted as I ran toward her. But as I rounded the front of my truck, I stopped dead in my tracks. The road was empty. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I looked, there was nothing but endless, empty highway stretching out before me. "This isn't happening," I muttered, running a shaky hand through my hair. I'd seen her clear as day, a woman with long dark hair wearing what looked like a white nightgown. She'd been right there, hadn't she? A coyote's howl echoed in the distance, snapping me out of my daze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I sensed something. A presence. I spun around, half expecting to see the woman standing behind me. But there was only my idling truck, its headlights casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I hurried back to the cab, slamming and locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I grabbed the CB radio mic. Breaker 1, 9, this is Big Red. Anybody got their ears on? Over? Static crackled for a moment before a gruff voice responded. This is Nighthawk. What's the word, Big Red? Over. I hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. How could I explain what I'd just seen or thought I'd seen? Just wondering if there have been any reports of pedestrians on Highway 50 tonight. Maybe someone in distress? Over. Negative, Big Red. It's been dead quiet out here. You see something? Over. I sighed, rubbing my tired eyes. I'm not sure, Nighthawk. Probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. Thanks anyway. Big Red out. I set the mic down, my gaze drifting to the empty road ahead. Maybe I'd dozed off for a split second. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a mirage born from too many hours behind the wheel. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I put the truck in gear, determined to make it to Ely without any more incidents. As the miles ticked by, I cranked up the radio, singing along to old country tunes in a desperate attempt to stay alert. 10 miles outside of Ely, I saw her again. This time, she was on the shoulder of the road, her pale form illuminated by my headlights. I slowed the truck, my body tensing as I approached. But just like before, she vanished the moment I drew near. Come on, get a grip, I muttered to myself. But my hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and a cold sweat had broken out across my brow. The lights of Ely came into view, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Just a few more minutes, and I'd be safe in the well-lit truck stop. I could grab some food, maybe splash some water on my face. Hell, maybe I'd even call it a night and get a real bed at the motel next door. As I approached the outskirts of town, a flashing sign caught my eye. Detour ahead. Follow signs. Orange barrels funneled traffic onto a narrow side road. You've got to be kidding me, I groaned. The detour wasn't on any of my maps or GPS, but I had no choice. The main road was completely blocked off. I carefully maneuvered my rig onto the unfamiliar road. The pavement was rough and the shoulder dropped off sharply on both sides. The town's lights faded behind me as the detour wound its way through scrubby desert terrain. 5 minutes passed, then 10, 15. This didn't feel right. I should have reached the other side of town by now. I was about to pull over and check my GPS when I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, exactly like the first time, but now she was much closer, close enough that I could make out details I'd missed before. Her long, dark hair wasn't just dark. It was matted and tangled, as if she'd been caught in a windstorm. The white nightgown was tattered and stained with something dark that looked unsettlingly like dried blood. And her face, God, her face. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow with an unearthly light. I slammed on the brakes, but this time she didn't disappear. She stood there, unmoving, as my truck skidded toward her. At the last possible second, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. The world tilted crazily as my rig left the road. I was weightless for a moment, then slammed back into my seat as the truck rolled. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass filled my ears. Pain exploded through my body as I was thrown about the cab like a rag doll. When the world finally stopped spinning, I found myself hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Blood dripped into my eyes from a gash on my forehead. Every breath sent daggers of pain through my ribs. Through the spider-webbed remains of my windshield, I could see a pair of bare feet on the pavement. My gaze traveled upward, taking in the tattered nightgown, the matted hair, the hollow eyes that now stared directly into mine. She took a step closer, then another. I struggled with my seatbelt, panic giving me a burst of adrenaline. I had to get out. I had to run. The seatbelt finally released, sending me crashing onto the roof of the overturned cab. I cried out as pain lanced through my left shoulder. Definitely dislocated, maybe worse. I kicked at the crumpled door, forcing it open enough to squeeze through. The cold desert air hit me like a slap to the face as I stumbled out of the wreckage. My legs buckled, and I fell to my knees on the rough asphalt. She was there, standing over me. This close, I could smell her, a sickly, sweet odor of decay that made my stomach lurch. Her mouth opened, revealing blackened teeth as she began to speak. "You saw me," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "You're the first in so long. The others, they always look away, they pretend not to see." I tried to scramble backward, but my injured shoulder screamed in protest. What are you?" I managed to choke out. A terrible smile spread across her face. I am what happens to those who are forgotten, those left behind. She reached out a skeletal hand. But you saw me, and now you can help me. Help you? I echoed, my mind reeling. How? By taking my place, she whispered. Ice flooded my veins as the meaning of her words sank in. With a surge of desperate energy, I staggered to my feet and ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was nothing but empty desert in every direction. But blind panic drove me forward. I could hear her behind me, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. The sound grew closer with each passing second. My lungs burned, and the pain in my shoulder had spread to encompass my entire left side. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I saw lights in the distance. A car. Salvation. I waved my good arm frantically, screaming at the top of my lungs, "Help! Please help me!" The car slowed as it approached. I wanted to cry with relief as it came to a stop next to me. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a concerned-looking middle-aged man. "You all right, buddy? What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to respond, to beg for help, to warn him about the thing chasing me. But no words came out. I tried again, but it was like my voice had been stolen. The man's expression changed from concern to unease. "Look, pal, I don't want any trouble. Maybe you should sleep it off, huh?" Before I could try to communicate again, he rolled up his window and drove off, leaving me alone in the darkness once more. "They can't hear you now," her voice came from right behind me. "Just like they couldn't hear me, you're part of the in-between now." I turned slowly, coming face to face with her once more, but something had changed. Her form seemed less solid now, more translucent, and behind her, I saw myself. My body, broken and bloody, still trapped in the wreckage of my truck. "No," I whispered, the truth crashing over me like a tidal wave. "This can't be happening. I can't be." "Dead?" She finished for me, that terrible smile returning. "Oh, but you are, and now you'll wait here. Wait for the next lonely soul driving down this highway. Wait for someone to finally see you." As she spoke, her form grew fainter and fainter until she disappeared entirely. In her place, I felt a heaviness settle over me, an unbearable loneliness that seemed to seep into my very bones. I looked down at my hands, watching in horror as my skin grew pale and my fingers elongated into skeletal claws. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In the distance, I heard the rumble of an approaching truck. I turned toward the sound, drawn by an irresistible pull. As the headlights appeared on the horizon, I took my place in the middle of the road and waited to be seen. The last thing I expected to find at the Oasis truck stop was a mystery that would haunt me for years to come. But as I pulled my rig into the lot that muggy July night, I had no idea I was about to step into a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. The neon sign flickered weakly against the inky sky as I maneuvered my semi into a spot between two other trucks. The air was thick with diesel fumes and the lingering odor of deep-fried food from the diner. Just another rest stop on another long haul, or so I thought. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on loose gravel. My back cracked as I stretched, working out the kinks from 10 straight hours on the road. The diner's windows glowed invitingly, promising hot coffee and a chance to feel human again. As I approached the entrance, the door swung open. A man in a worn trucker cap stumbled out, his eyes wide and unfocused. He bumped into me, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "You gotta help me, man," he slurred, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "I can't find Jerry. He's just gone." I tried to gently disengage myself. "Easy there, pal. Who's Jerry?" The man's bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. "My partner. We always ride together, always, but now he's vanished and nobody remembers seeing him." Before I could respond, a harried-looking waitress appeared in the doorway. "There you are, Frank," she said, her tone a mix of concern and exasperation. "Come on back inside. We'll call you a cab." Frank's grip on my arm tightened. "You believe me, don't you? Jerry's real. He's out there somewhere." The waitress shot me an apologetic look as she pried Frank's fingers loose. "I'm sorry about that. Frank's had a rough night. Don't pay him any mind." I watched as she led the protesting man back inside. Something about the encounter left me unsettled, but I chalked it up to road fatigue and too much gas station coffee. I needed real food and a chance to clear my head. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of other drivers hunched over plates of greasy comfort food. I slid into a booth, the cracked vinyl seats squeaking beneath me. A tired-looking waitress, different from the one who dealt with Frank, appeared with a menu and a pot of coffee. "Rough night?" she asked, nodding toward the door. I shrugged as I accepted a steaming mug. Caught the tail end of it. "What's the story there?" The waitress, her name tag read Doreen, sighed heavily. "Frank's been here for hours, getting more worked up by the minute. Keeps insisting his driving partner is missing, but he came in alone." "You're sure?" I asked, remembering the desperation in Frank's eyes. Doreen's expression softened. "Hun, I've been working this shift for 15 years. I see every soul that comes through that door. Frank rolled in solo around sunset, already 3 sheets to the wind." I nodded, pushing aside the nagging feeling in my gut. Maybe he just got his wires crossed. Long hauls can do funny things to a person's head. "Ain't that the truth?" Doreen agreed. "Now what can I get you?" I ordered the blue plate special and tried to put Frank out of my mind. But as I picked at my meatloaf and mashed potatoes, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I'd met my share of drunks and addicts on the road, but Frank's fear had seemed too raw, too real to be a simple hallucination. After finishing my meal, I decided to poke around a bit before hitting the road again. I told myself it was just curiosity, maybe a touch of boredom. But deep down, I knew it was something more. A primal instinct warning me that all was not right at the Oasis truck stop. I circled the parking lot, peering into the cabs of idle rigs. Most were dark and silent, their drivers likely catching some shut-eye before the next leg of their journey. But one truck stood out, a battered Peterbilt with its driver's side door hanging open. As I approached, I could see that the cab was empty, but something on the passenger seat caught my eye. A half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels and a dog-eared road atlas. I leaned in closer, my heart rate picking up as I spotted a name scrawled on the atlas cover. Property of Jerry Hawkins. "Hey!" a gruff voice called out behind me. I spun around to find a burly man in a security uniform glaring at me. "Step away from the vehicle, sir." I raised my hands, taking a step back. "Sorry, officer, I was just looking for someone." The guard's eyes narrowed. "You Frank's buddy? We already told him. There's no Jerry here. Never was." "No, I'm not with Frank," I said quickly. "I'm just passing through, but I couldn't help overhearing earlier, and I thought maybe I could help clear things up." The guard's posture relaxed slightly, but suspicion still radiated from him. "Clear what up?" I gestured to the open cab. "That atlas on the seat. It's got the name Jerry Hawkins written on it." For a moment, confusion flickered across the guard's face. Then his expression hardened. "Nice try, but I'm not falling for it. That truck's been empty all night. Now, I suggest you get back on the road before I have to call this in." I opened my mouth to argue, but something in the guard's eyes stopped me. It wasn't just annoyance or authority, it was fear. This man knew something, and he was desperate to keep it under wraps. I mumbled an apology and retreated to my own rig. As I climbed into the cab, my mind raced. What the hell was going on here? I fired up the engine, but instead of pulling out, I just sat there watching the Peterbilt in my side mirror. Minutes ticked by. The guard made a few circuits of the lot before disappearing back into the diner. Just as I was about to give up and leave, I saw movement near the Peterbilt. A figure emerged from the shadows. Frank. He glanced furtively around before clambering into the cab of the mystery truck. My heart pounded as I watched him rummage around inside, clearly searching for something. Suddenly, Frank froze. Even from a distance, I could see the color drain from his face. He scrambled out of the cab, clutching something to his chest. As he hurried across the lot, I made out what he was holding. The road atlas. Without thinking, I hopped out of my truck and jogged after him. "Frank!" I called out. "Wait up!" He whirled around, eyes wild with panic. When he saw me, relief washed over his features. "You," he said. "You're the one who believed me." I approached cautiously, hands raised to show I meant no harm. "I'm not sure what I believe, Frank, but I know something strange is happening here. Can you tell me what's going on?" Frank glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Not here," he hissed. "They're watching, always watching. Meet me at the Cactus Motel, 2 miles down the road, room 17, 1 hour." Before I could respond, he took off running, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. The smart move would be to get back in my truck and put this weird little truck stop in my rearview mirror, but I knew I couldn't do that. The mystery of Jerry Hawkins had its hooks in me now, and I had to see it through. An hour later, I found myself standing outside room 17 of the Cactus Motel, a dilapidated joint that had seen better days. My knuckles had barely grazed the door when it flew open. Frank yanked me inside, slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt. The room stank of stale cigarettes and desperation. Frank paced back and forth, the road atlas clutched to his chest like a talisman. His eyes darted to every corner, as if expecting someone or something to materialize at any moment. "All right, Frank," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "I'm here. Tell me what's going on." He stopped pacing and fixed me with a haunted stare. "They took him," he whispered. "They took Jerry, and now they're trying to erase him, make it like he never existed." "Who took him?" I asked. "And why?" Frank shook his head violently. "I don't know who they are, some kind of government thing maybe, or something worse. All I know is 1 minute Jerry was there and the next, gone. Poof. Like he'd never been born." He thrust the atlas at me. I opened it, finding page after page covered in Jerry's neat handwriting. Notes on routes, fuel stops, even little observations about the towns they'd passed through. "See?" Frank said, his voice cracking. "He was real. He is real. But they're trying to make us all forget." I leafed through the atlas, a chill running down my spine. This was solid evidence, far more than the ramblings of a drunk, but it raised more questions than it answered. "Frank," I said slowly, "what do you think happened to Jerry?" He collapsed onto the bed, his energy suddenly spent. "I don't know, man, but I've heard whispers, other drivers who've lost people. It's like some kind of harvest. They take people who won't be missed, people always on the move." A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, a car rumbled past, its headlights briefly illuminating the grimy window. "We've got to do something," I said finally. "Report this to the police or—" Frank's bitter laugh cut me off. "Police? They're in on it, man. Everyone is. Or they will be, soon as they realize what's happening." He stood up suddenly, shoving the atlas into my hands. "You take this. Get it somewhere safe. I'm going to go back, try to find more proof. Maybe if we can gather enough evidence, someone will listen." "Frank, wait," I protested. "We should stick together. Safety in numbers, right?" But he was already heading for the door. "Can't risk it. They're on to me now. But you're still under the radar. You're our best shot." Before I could argue further, he was gone, the door banging shut behind him. I stood there, clutching the atlas, feeling like I'd stepped into some kind of twisted twilight zone. Part of me wanted to drop the atlas and run, to put as many miles between myself and this insanity as possible. But I knew I couldn't do that. Jerry Hawkins had been real, and now he was gone. How many others had vanished without a trace? How long before someone I knew disappeared? I tucked the atlas into my jacket and slipped out of the motel room. As I walked back to my truck, every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. I kept expecting to feel a hand on my shoulder, to turn and find myself face to face with whatever forces had taken Jerry. But I made it back to my rig unmolested. As I pulled out of the Oasis truck stop, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw Frank standing in the middle of the lot waving goodbye. But when I blinked, he was gone. I merged onto the highway, the atlas riding shotgun beside me. I didn't know where this road would take me, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't rest until I uncovered the truth about Jerry Hawkins and all the others who had vanished without a trace. The night stretched out before me, full of shadows and secrets. And somewhere out there, the truth was waiting to be found. The first cold spot hit me like a bucket of ice water to the face. One second I was cruising down I-40 with the windows down, enjoying the warm summer breeze. The next, my teeth were chattering and goosebumps erupted across my arms. Little did I know this was just the beginning of the longest, most terrifying night of my life. My name's Mike, and I've been hauling freight across the country for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my share of weird stuff out on the open road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that muggy July night in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. The day had started like any other. I'd picked up a load in Amarillo, Texas, bound for Nashville. It was a straight shot east on I-40, a route I'd driven more times than I could count. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I settled in for a long night of driving. The cab of my Peterbilt was my second home, and I was looking forward to the peaceful solitude of the highway after dark. Around midnight, I crossed the Oklahoma state line. The radio crackled with static as I lost signal from the Texas stations. I fumbled with the dial, trying to find some tunes to keep me company. That's when I felt it, a sudden bone-chilling cold that seemed to come out of nowhere. I jerked my hand back from the radio, my breath visible in the air. "What the hell?" I muttered, checking the AC controls. But everything was normal. The vents were blowing warm air, just as they had been all night. As quickly as it had come, the cold vanished. I shook my head, chalking it up to a weird draft or my imagination playing tricks on me. But a seed of unease had been planted in the pit of my stomach. For the next hour, everything seemed normal. The familiar hum of my rig's engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on asphalt lulled me into a sense of security. But then it happened again. This time, the cold was so intense it felt like my blood had turned to ice. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with the effort of keeping the truck steady. Frost began to form on the inside of the windshield, spreading in delicate patterns across the glass. "Jesus Christ," I breathed, my words forming a thick cloud in front of my face. I flicked on the defroster, but it made no difference. The cold seemed to be coming from inside the cab itself, an oppressive presence that bore down on me from all sides. I glanced at the temperature gauge on my dashboard. It read 92 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, heat waves still shimmered off the blacktop. This wasn't just some freak weather phenomenon. Something was very, very wrong. As the minutes ticked by, the cold spots became more frequent and more intense. They'd hit without warning, lasting anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes. Each time, I felt a little more of my sanity slip away. How could it be so damn cold when everything around me said it should be sweltering? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a problem with my truck's climate control system. Maybe I was coming down with something and these were fever chills. Hell, maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and this was all some kind of twisted dream. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit. This was something else entirely, something that defied logic and reason. Around 2 a.m., I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest area. My nerves were shot and I desperately needed a break from the road and from whatever the hell was happening inside my cab. I signaled and began to slow down, relief washing over me at the thought of stepping out into the warm night air. That's when things went from weird to terrifying. As I eased onto the exit ramp, the coldest blast yet slammed into me. It felt like I'd been plunged into the Arctic Ocean. My breath caught in my throat and I could swear I felt ice crystals forming in my lungs. The steering wheel became slick with frost under my hands and I struggled to keep control of the rig. But it wasn't just the cold this time. In the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. There in the passenger seat sat a figure. It was hazy and indistinct, like looking at a person through frosted glass. But there was no mistaking the human shape, or the way it slowly turned its head to face me. I let out a strangled yell, instinctively jerking the wheel to the right. The truck lurched, tires screeching as I overcorrected. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to jackknife right there on the exit ramp. Somehow I managed to wrestle the rig back under control. I stomped on the brakes, bringing the truck to a shuddering halt on the shoulder of the road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands clenched on the wheel, too terrified to move. The cold had vanished again, replaced by the stuffy heat of a summer night in Oklahoma. Slowly, I turned to look at the passenger seat. It was empty. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. I was losing it. The long hours, the monotony of the road, it was all finally getting to me. I needed sleep, real sleep, not just cat naps at rest stops. I reached for the door handle, determined to step outside and clear my head. But as my fingers touched the cold metal, a thought stopped me cold. What if it wasn't just in the cab? What if, whatever it was out there too? The idea of leaving the relative safety of my truck suddenly seemed insane. At least in here, I was surrounded by familiar territory. Out there in the dark, anything could be waiting. I pulled my hand back and sat there, paralyzed with indecision. The silence in the cab was deafening, broken only by my ragged breathing. Minutes ticked by as I weighed my options, each one seeming worse than the last. Finally, I made a decision. I was a professional, damn it. I had a schedule to keep and a load to deliver. Whatever was happening, I couldn't let it stop me from doing my job. I'd push on to the next major town, find a motel, and get some proper rest. Things would look better in the daylight. With shaking hands, I put the truck in gear and eased back onto the highway. For the next hour, I drove in tense silence, every muscle in my body coiled tight as a spring. I kept expecting the cold to return, or to see that ghostly figure out of the corner of my eye. But nothing happened. Just as I was starting to relax, to think that maybe the worst was over, it hit me again. This time, the cold was accompanied by a sound, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It rose in pitch, becoming a scream that set my teeth on edge and made my skin crawl. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the terrible noise. The steering wheel began to shake violently beneath my hands, and I realized with horror that I was losing control of the truck. It was like some invisible force was trying to wrench the wheel from my grasp. "Stop it!" I shouted, not sure if I was talking to the truck, the cold, or the unseen presence that seemed to be tormenting me. "Just stop." As if in response, the wailing cut off abruptly. The truck steadied, and I found myself able to breathe again. But the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It felt expectant, like the calm before a storm. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 3:33 a.m. The witching hour, some part of my mind whispered. I'd never been a superstitious man, but right then, I was willing to believe in just about anything. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. It was the same hazy, indistinct shape I'd seen in the passenger seat earlier. But now it was much larger, looming impossibly tall in the glare of my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, bracing for impact. But instead of the sickening thud I expected, there was nothing. The truck passed right through the figure as if it wasn't there. In my rearview mirror, I saw it turn, watching me drive away. Cold sweat dripped down my back as I pressed the accelerator to the floor. I didn't care about speed limits or fuel efficiency anymore. I just needed to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever the hell that thing was. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. The cold spots continued to hit me at random intervals, each one accompanied by some new horror whispers in my ear, ghostly hands clutching at my arms, glimpses of terrifying faces in my mirrors. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I was a wreck. My hands were cramped from gripping the wheel so tightly, and my eyes burned from the effort of staying alert. But I'd made it through the night. As the sun rose, painting the sky in warm hues of pink and gold, the oppressive presence that had haunted me all night seemed to recede. The cold spots became less frequent, then stopped altogether. By the time I rolled into Nashville, sweaty and exhausted but alive, it almost felt like a distant nightmare. But I knew better. The memory of that night was seared into my brain, as real and tangible as the steering wheel under my hands. I've tried to rationalize it in the months since. Stress, exhaustion, maybe even some kind of gas leak in my cab. But deep down, I know the truth. Something happened out there on that lonely stretch of I-40. Something that defies explanation. And as I sit here in this truck stop, penning this account, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That somewhere out there in the vast darkness between cities, it's waiting. Waiting for the next unsuspecting trucker to drive through its domain. Waiting to make itself known in a burst of bone-chilling cold on a hot summer night. So if you're out there on the road and you feel that first icy touch, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Just drive as fast and as far as you can, and pray that the sun comes up before it catches you.